You call this a room? This is a pigsty.
But in all candor, I would tell you it's outrageous filth, and we've got to do something about it. I take the tempered approach, and yet I would make the exception that if I could find some way constitutionally to do away with it, I would.
I want you to straighten up this area now!
The PMRC proposal is an ill-conceived piece of nonsense which fails to deliver any real benefits to children, infringes the civil liberties of people who are not children, and promises to keep the courts busy for years dealing with the interpretational and enforcemental problems inherent in the proposal's design.
You are a disgusting slob!
The admission by Robert Halford that they placed backwards material on albums is a great piece of evidence. They have denied that for 4 years, but under oath, he admitted to it, and I think it's the turning point of this case.
Are you listening to me? What do you want to do with your life?
I want to rock.
The freedom to express oneself is a value held in high regard by many of us in the United States and across the world. It's seen as a fundamental human right, so important that it was the first one outlined in the Constitution as it was drafted. And as a fan of heavy metal, particularly the era of hard rock and heavy metal that we're going to cover today, I've seen plenty of shock value lyrics, over-the-top stage attire, and raunchy album covers. Whether it's Merciful Fate in their debut EP, or Motley Crue in their glamorous obsession with hairspray and women. It is an art form expressed to rile up anyone who might take offense to it. For decades now, these acts have helped drive moral panic. Whether it's Beatlemania, Led Zeppelin backmasking, or Venom's intentional use of satanic imagery to rail against the machine and scare our parents, we've gathered under the Headbanger banner to do just that. But this music and its expressions are a lot more to a lot of people. To some, they're representations of better times in their life. To others, it serves as a conduit for anger, pain, and trauma. And to many, it's just good music. So when regulatory bodies and daddy government itself threatens to get involved with doing away with it, they create an important battleground that not only serves to tarnish heavy metal, but artistic expression as a whole. Whether it's in the halls of Congress or a civil courtroom, heavy metal has faced many adversaries over its multi-decade tenure on top of the world. Today, we're going to look at how mediums get to the point of governmental intervention and showcase which champions of the cause that we have to thank for its continued existence. So, let's see who fought the law and how they fared doing so.
This video is an edutainment piece that combines historical facts with subjective commentary. The factual information has been carefully researched, but the commentary reflects the personal views of Hawkenlode and may not align with other perspectives. This content is not intended to endorse or criticize any particular political affiliation.
All right, hey, enough, man. A list, please, Ma. Sure, that's all you need when you're 6 years old now. Here's the list of words your dad and I don't ever want to hear you say. Oh, thanks, Ma. Hey, that'll save me an ass kicking, you know? There's no list.
Born in Manhattan, New York in 1937, George Dennis Patrick Carlin would come of age in a world torn by war and in a United States on the brink of a utopian age of economic security in a rapidly evolving culture. He was raised alongside his brother by a single mother. As he aged into a rebellious young adult, he enlisted in the United States Air Force and began training as a radar technician. During his tenure with the armed forces, he would be court-martialed 3 times and was reprimanded by superiors many more times than that. He would receive a general discharge in 1957. While enlisted, Carlin was stationed in Louisiana, where he began working as a radio DJ in Shreveport. And while he wouldn't rise through the ranks of radio DJs, that job would lead him into what he would be most known for, a pillar and founding father of the art of stand-up comedy. George Carlin would rise to prominence as a voice of countercultural commentary, utilizing genius linguistic art to get his points across to a public who was both enchanted and outraged with him. As Carlin's previously clean Tonight Show-friendly routines aged into the American 1970s, he would begin to perfect what is likely his most famous work, the 7 dirty words you can't say on television, which, funny enough, are also the 7 dirty words among 7,000 other dirty words that you can't say on YouTube. So, this video should be fun. The routine, put simply, was a critique of how some words are profane, but that profane had a different standard depending on where you were and who you were around. It was built, morphed, and performed many times and is one of comedy's greatest works. As Carlin took the stage at the Milwaukee Summerfest in July of 1972, he again performed his flagship bit, but as he exited that stage, he would be immediately arrested and charged with disturbing the peace for his obscene and vulgar words. His artistic expression resulted in the law restricting his freedom under the guise of obscenity concerns. The entire event would spotlight and set fire to a debate on free speech as it's defined under the First Amendment of the Constitution. And while the incident would be a rough night for the comedian, it ultimately furthered his push into the mainstream, effectively making him a figure in driving the cultural consciousness. Incidentally, his routine would also drive broadcast standards concerning the content allowed after a New York radio station played a variation of the bit in the middle of the afternoon. The broadcast would incite the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, which is a governmental body in charge of what is and isn't allowed to be broadcast over radio and network television, to lodge a complaint and sue the Pacifica Foundation, which owned the radio station in question. The lawsuit would make it to the Supreme Court, with Carlin's routine being played in the country's highest courtroom, leading to the Supreme Court in a 5-4 decision upholding the FCC's authority to regulate the broadcast of indecent material. Justice John Paul Stevens, writing as a representative of the remaining justices, argued that the government had a compelling interest in shielding children from potentially offensive material and ensuring that unwanted speech does not intrude into the privacy of one's home. He emphasized the unique nature of the broadcast medium, which is pervasive and easily accessible to children. The ruling affirmed the FCC's power to regulate public airwaves, particularly during the hours when children are likely to be listening, leading to more cautious approaches by broadcasters, especially during the daytime and early evening hours, to avoid FCC sanctions. It also led to the establishment of safe harbor hours, allowing the adult swim time between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. for indecent but not obscene material to be broadcast. Good old daddy government protecting the innocent children from dirty words and ideas. If you've seen my previous video highlighting the satanic panic of the 1980s, or if you lived it yourself, you'll understand the role that moral panic has in shaping culture and ideas. The fear of corruption that is cast on media can reach terrible heights, especially in a world of idealized standards. Be it the satanic panic or the Red Scare, our inherent compulsion to protect and shield the youth among us can lead to causes of police misconduct or poor therapeutic practices, resulting in the exact opposite of what we set out to accomplish. Satanic panic, for example, has led to memories being implanted in young children of ritualistic abuse, which undoubtedly set a heavy weight upon their shoulders as they progress through life. The parents of the McMartin preschool scandal were firmly under the belief that they were robbed of justice, while the government footed the massive financial cost of a witch trial lasting nearly a decade. But moral panics have been a staple of public discourse since the beginning of human societies, and didn't begin or end in the 1980s. The government's role in these panics and how they affect the law traces back decades and happens in lockstep with the progression of both culture and technology. In a representative government during an age of finite mass media sources, how offended parents feel will certainly drive the way they vote, in turn driving the way laws are created and enforced. So to set the stage for how impactful later events would become, we have to start a bit farther back than the good old 1980s. And though music will be the protagonist of this battle against censorship, broadcast media has a large part to play, be it with melody, film, or ink and paper. As the United States and the Allies emerged victorious from World War II, the country entered a state of unprecedented economic stability. The youth of the country would be granted their teenage years in a way that the previous generation wasn't blessed with. The 1950s saw these teenagers take the reins of popular culture as this economic system began to recognize them as an untapped market. With the rise of artists like Elvis Presley and Chuck Berry, rock and roll music became the soundtrack to the American 1950s youth takeover. And with their parents being raised in strict wartime environments, the music would go on to represent rebellion and delinquency. Elvis, in his rise to megastardom, saw music itself becoming a mainstream artistic expression in a way that it hadn't before. The genre would quickly be connected to teenage rebellion and juvenile misconduct, and was even banned from some radio stations across the country. The moral panic the traditionalist generation was having over this music and the artists creating it was quickly ignited, and it wasn't just music that these parents were railing out against. Another youth-targeted entertainment medium existed in the form of comic books. With the paperback picture books being decades old, the way the medium was utilized had evolved right along with the culture. Horror and crime genres were huge at the time, sparking even more panic among parents that these stories were inspiring young men and women to turn to a life of crime. By the middle of the decade, a self-regulatory body known as the CCA, or Comics Code Authority, was established in response to a U.S. Senate hearing regarding juvenile delinquency in 1954. Dr. Frederick Wortham, a psychiatrist and author of Seduction of the Innocent, would argue the harm of comic books on children, citing graphic violence, sexual innuendos, and depictions of crime. The CCA was strict, likely in a bid to keep the federal government from taking the reins, and as their regulations were enacted, the country saw a boom in superhero-related stories. A boom that is arguably still alive and well today. Since the stories were easier to fit inside the criteria acceptable, they quickly took over the medium, pushing more explicit styles into underground communities. All of this would take place before the decade was even half over, and concerns over youth corruption would only grow as time ticked out of the 1950s. As rock and roll and pop culture progressed through the remainder of the decade, it would only solidify the control that teenagers had over it. With the rising popularity of television, American Bandstand would spread rock and roll to a national audience. The golden age of American exceptionalism and extended time of peace would see the ruling population take aim at teenagers and their media, pinning them as the biggest threat to their traditional American values. It's a tale as old as rock and roll itself, and wouldn't end with the decade. In fact, it would only grow as the country entered the 1960s. As the Beatles took the stage of the Ed Sullivan Show, they would light a fire across the United States known as the British Invasion. With bands like the Rolling Stones following suit, and with the American youth so enamored with this foreign-born media, traditionalist parents would have their underskirts in a bunch, even more than they had in the 1950s. Rock and roll would rise to not only represent youth culture, but also the younger demographic's progressive ideals. The civil rights movement and desegregation would mark a significant change in the cultural norms, further alienating the silent generation from their baby boomer children. As the cultural shift intensified, it gave birth to the free love movement, unleashing the peaceful wrath of the hippies all over the country. It was a wild west of free expression. The media was no exception, with not only music evolving, but independent filmmaking becoming more and more prevalent. The Motion Picture Association of America, or MPAA, established in its original form nearly at the beginning of film's rise in national attention, would close out the decade with its rating system, designed to inform parents about the kind of content featured in whichever film they're gathering in the theaters to watch. These guidelines were quite strictly enforced to keep the federal government from stepping in to regulate them. Ultimately, they were looking to keep censorship in their own hands, much like the comic book industry had the decade prior. Parents of the decade were those raised during the McCarthy-era Red Scare, likely cementing their traditionalist outlook on culture and child rearing. Fear of secret communist communities would be put in the background after the 50s came to an end, but still lent to an aversion to change. The free love movement and its desegregated and psychedelic aesthetic were enough to evoke disdain, and once events like the Manson family murders took place, their place in the culture would begin to fizzle out as the country and rock music entered the 70s.
All right, Houston! You wanted it best and you got it! The hottest band in the land! Kids!
Some of my all-time favorite rock music was put on wax in the 70s. Whether we're talking about essential figures like Motorhead, AC/DC, Black Sabbath, Deep Purple, Led Zeppelin, I really could go on forever. To me at least, this is the foundational combination of proto-metal and heavy metal founding fathers creating a timeless sound and setting the stage for everything that came after it. Some of these names were the biggest in the world at the time, and it seemed like the choices were endless for youth looking to rile up their parents. Plenty of these bands would be a thorn in the side of the uptight older demographic, but it was the acts that intentionally leaned into this that I think are worth noting for the sake of today's story. Acts like Alice Cooper. By the mid-70s, Alice Cooper was a seasoned stage presence and had crafted a persona and mystique that was ready to dominate the world. Welcome to My Nightmare would mark a further development in his showmanship and bring shock rock to a mass audience. His over-the-top and shocking stage theatrics would birth mythic tales ranging from devil worship to chickens being sacrificed and torn to shreds by the crowd at live shows. But the genius of it all was not bringing a shock and awe to the audience, but maintaining and refusing to explain away any of these legendary stories, allowing them to grow and morph. Rock music was no stranger to crazy claims of things like backmasking or brainwashing, so it would only make sense that once these concerns were raised, there would be someone there to make sure you had something to be concerned about. And on the same hand, you had essential rock star blueprints like Kiss. Hailing from New York City in the early 1970s, Kiss would almost immediately garner attention for their larger-than-life stage show, no matter how small the stage was. Be it their use of pyrotechnics, their brilliantly branded face paint and stage attire, or stunts involving spitting fire and spewing blood. They were absolutely not going to be ignored. As Kiss rose to prominence in the rock music scene, they would harness that fear of spectacle and become the hottest band in the land. However you feel about the Knights in Satan's Service, or where Kiss ended up in the modern day, they absolutely dominated the 70s and scared parents and old-timers to the core. All of this would culminate in an explosion of heavy metal from the mid-70s through the early 80s, with one of the most notable movements being the new wave of British heavy metal. As these acts made their way across the pond, it seemed that a select few would look to one-up the shocking nature, be it with explicit satanic imagery or overtly sexual themes. Heavy metal was poised to explode into the 1980s. Rock music and adult themes have gone hand in hand for as long as the works have been around. With the increase in gain on the guitars, so too was the raunchy subject matter, serving as a snapshot of how lustful young adults, especially ones that are on top of the world as rock stars, can be. Blues rock, hard rock, and heavy metal as it evolved through the 70s was no exception. And with satanic elements from heavy metal torchbearers, or anti-establishment themes from the budding punk rock movements from both the States and the UK, an assault on traditional values was coming from multiple fronts. On top of inspiring fear in parents, these influences would also inspire the next wave of heavy metal superstars. You had an era of forefather acts like Ozzy Osbourne, Iron Maiden, and Judas Priest continuing to rise in popularity. There were new up-and-coming stars like Motley Crue, Poison, and Bon Jovi bringing high-gain leads, reverb-heavy drums, and a lot of hairspray to the airwaves as well. With lyrical content ranging from fantastical mythical stories to satanic and blasphemous musings to explicit below-the-belt desires, there was plenty for parents and older generations to be concerned about at the time. But it was perhaps the launch of MTV on August 1st, 1981 that would play the biggest role in exactly how monolithic heavy metal would become in popular culture. Sure, there were plenty of pop idols and stereotypical one-hit wonder acts as well, but the birth of the music video would connect with teenagers in a way that the country hadn't quite seen before. Over the next few years, the network would explode in popularity and become an integral part of the music industry and its ability to create successful acts. And with a visual medium added to the already concerning lyrical content, there was no shortage of ways for these bands, pop outfits, and superstars to rebel against a fairly uptight generation of parental figures. For a medium aimed at teenagers, what better way to sell your wares than scaring the parents of your biggest demographic? So for the music industry to end up in the crosshairs of the American government with threats of legal action and regulation, what was the dark, demonic, putrid filth that scared parents so deeply that Uncle Sam had to get involved? Was it Dio and his demonic Dungeons and Dragons-esque lore? Was it Merciful Fate and their satanic shock rock imagery and lyrical content? Was it Motley Crue and their insatiable libido and thirst for party? Nah, it was Prince. Prince was a wildly talented musician, songwriter, and filmmaker. From his debut album For You in 1978, He showed off an array of influences and talents. His 1982 release, 1999, would further his popularity, but it would be 1984's Purple Rain, which had an accompanying film that would put Prince into the stratosphere. But one radar that Purple Rain would put Prince on would be that of Tipper Gore, the wife of then-Senator Al Gore. In 1985, after purchasing Purple Rain for her 11-year-old daughter and hearing the explicit lyrics featured in the track Darling Nikki, she was appalled at what she had just unknowingly purchased. Feeling that something needed to be done to protect children and inform parents, she assembled the Washington Wives and co-founded the Parents Music Resource Center, or PMRC, in a bid to do exactly that. Fearing the rise of the explicit nature of the music industry, the PMRC aimed to give parents more control over it, taking particular aim at those explicit lyrics, extreme violence, and use being promoted by the major acts of the time. The PMRC would move quickly, campaigning for a self-regulatory rating system to be implemented to inform parents prior to purchase about the content of the music. They compiled a list of 15 particular bands and songs, along with how they interpreted the lyrical content in relation to how they would damage children. The aforementioned Darling Nikki would top the Filthy 15, but the list would also include bands like AC/DC, Black Sabbath, Merciful Fate, Wasp, Venom, and more. But a particular member of the Filthy 15 with Twisted Sister and their rebellious anthem We're Not Gonna Take It would prove to be probably the most integral to where the PMRC would take their clamoring for censorship and labeling.
Subtlety, suggestions, and innuendo have given way to overt expressions and descriptions of often violent sexual acts, taking, and flirtations with the occult. The record album covers, to me, are self-explanatory. And I'd like to show just a sampling of a record cover. Pyromania, no question. Burn a building, burn, burn, burn.
Tipper Gore and the PMRC were concerned with the content being put on wax and spread to impressionable children. The Filthy 15 and their concerns regarding them ranged from violence to adult themes. And while satanic and occult themes were a concern, they weren't really the biggest thorn in the PMRC's side. So I'm not going to harp on Lucifer too much. There are only so many videos you can make on satanic cults before people start thinking that you're on their payroll. I'm not, but if there are any secret underground satanic cults looking to sponsor a YouTuber, I'm available. And broke. Call me. The PMRC's campaign would ultimately lead to the Recording Industry Association of America, or RIAA, to compromise on their demands, and they agreed to add labeling to their products. But before they could be implemented, the United States Senate would intervene, calling a hearing to discuss the growing issue of corn rock and where the music industry had failed the public. It's corn because I can't say the other word that it actually is. So I'm saying corn rock. Get it? Just a month after the RIAA agreed to terms in September of 1985, the United States Senate would assemble and call to the table multiple major musical figures. The PMRC would continue to testify in favor of a rating system and serve to simply shine a light on the cockroaches within the music industry selling smut to their children. They would assemble 3 key figures to testify and answer for their crimes of expression, and it seemed like a slam dunk for the PMRC and their fear-mongering. Opening statements would express that no legislation would be promoted at the hearings, but that it would simply serve as a public forum to discuss the increasingly suggestive nature of rock music being sold to children. There's also this bit here that boils down to don't use more dirty words than you have to, in clear anticipation of these mongoloid headbangers railing against the man. It's also a clear bipartisan issue that both political factions could really get behind, and showed a mindset that if it was within constitutional power, these members of our government would, quote, do away with it, which seems really concerning and dystopian. to me personally. But what the PMRC and congressmen were teeing up for wouldn't quite go the way they expected. As the PMRC and their representatives displayed album covers and lyrics to the crowd and those watching at home, they would outline their grievances with an array of popular acts. What they were calling for and how they presented it was sure to frighten and elicit visceral responses from parents and legislators. But on the side of freedom of expression, Frank Zappa, an eccentric and prolific composer and musician, would rail against the PMRC's attempt to flame the art. As a free speech advocate, Zappa was fiercely opposed to any form of censorship, and likened the PMRC's proposals to treating dandruff with decapitation, and pointed out the clear moral panic they were participating in. Folk legend John Denver was also called to testify. His wholesome persona and appeal to older demographics would likely have him agreeing with the PMRC and backing up their fears from within the music industry itself. But that isn't what happened at all. Denver, like Zappa before him, was also against censorship of artistic expression, pointing out how his classic song Rocky Mountain High had been misconstrued as a reference to drugs, highlighting how artistic works can be mislabeled and misjudged by the listener of the art itself. Putting any hard confines on this expression would serve to stifle creativity, and overall would see music in a dystopian place. And while Zappa and Denver quite eloquently conveyed the view from behind the eyes of the artists, when the PMRC and the hearings are talked about in retrospect, one representative stands above the others in how well he was able to get the message across, even if the Karen Committee chose him for his wild look and rock star status.
What feeling do you have towards teenagers? Do you think you have to put an image forward that they'll understand and take notice of? Do you think they take notice of?
Well, I don't just, do things for teenagers. I do it for everybody, and only thing I really concern myself with is being honest. Because I think that people hate insincerity, and I can't curse, but BS. You know what BS stands for? Use your imagination.
Yes,
okay.
Yeah.
And I think that as long as you're honest with people, that's the bottom line.
Daniel D. Snyder was born in Queens, New York in March of 1955 and grew up in a lower middle class family. He showed an interest in music early in his life, and in 1976, he would join Twisted Sister as their lead vocalist, eventually going on to be the band's sole songwriter. The outfit's third studio album, Stay Hungry, would launch them into the limelight with classic anthems like I Wanna Rock and, of course, the Filthy 15 approved We're Not Gonna Take It. The latter track would make the list for its over-the-top violence, which, if you know anything about that particular song, goes far to show you exactly how out of touch these people were when assigning their grievances. With Twisted Sister's wild on-stage appearance and theatrical presence, selecting Snyder seemed to be a calculated move, as the PMRC and Congress would expect the man behind the makeup to be as wild as his Twisted Sister alter ego. Whether you like Twisted Sister or not, or whether you feel he was the best option, D. Snyder was now up to bat representing all of heavy metal in a forum surrounded by people looking to stifle the genre's expression.
Now it's important to clearly state what our proposal is not. A voluntary labeling is not censorship. Censorship implies restricting access or suppressing content. This proposal does neither. Moreover, it involves no government action.
D. Snyder would take his place at the table, dressed in a denim vest with his signature full-bodied hair. But it would be his well-prepared testimony and articulate conveying of his message that would not only wow onlookers, but solidified the message of anti-censorship in a way that represented heavy metal at its finest.
I don't know if it's morning or afternoon, but I'll say both. Good morning and good afternoon. My name is D. Snyder, that's S-N-I-D-E-R. Since I seem to be the only person addressing this committee today who has been a direct target of accusations from the presumably responsible PMRC, I would like to use this occasion to speak on a more personal note and show just how unfair the whole concept of lyrical interpretation and judgment can be, and how many times this can amount to little more than character assassination.
Snyder would express his disdain for the RIAA's agreeing to generic labels on music products, believing that it should be retracted. He too would eloquently convey the message in favor of artistic expression in a way that contrasted his choice of attire and image that scared the attending members of government, their wives, and the PMRC and any concerned parents actually watching C-SPAN at the time. It would be a killing blow of free speech advocating that, in hindsight, certainly lent to a fizzling out of the moral panic beginning to take hold over explicit lyrical content specifically. And while the country was in the midst of a satanic panic, occult themes would arguably overshadow explicit ones when it came to striking fear in parental figures. Snyder's testimony was not only historical for the headbanger history books, but for the general American history of free speech and First Amendment advocacy. He would enter the hearing as a dumb, hard-partying rock star regardless of the reality, and exit a hero of artists in every form of media. But as much of a killing blow as it may have seemed, the PMRC would exit this hearing with egg on their face, but with victory in hand. They would swiftly get their warning labels as requested and campaigned for. And while it was a self-regulatory action, meaning no legal power would be leveraged, it was still a victory for the Parents Music Resource Center and their crusade against dirty, vile rock and roll. But the reality that they were getting ready to face would be a beautiful example of the Streisand effect in action. And while they would get what they wanted, it wouldn't quite work out the way that they'd hoped. The RIAA would implement the parental advisory explicit content label shortly after the hearing concluded in an effort to save face after the PMRC's campaign and stave off any legislation or boycotting from concerned parents. But as the labels began to see record store shelves, they would become a massive spotlight for exactly the records kids would want if they were looking to buck the system, resulting in an explosion of record sales. With these tipper sucker labels, the youth of the era would be drawn to them like moths, resulting in the exact opposite of what the PMRC was looking to do. Instead of shying away from explicit content to avoid the labels, bands would lean into them, wearing them with pride as a badge of honor, and legions of loyal headbangers would feel even more empowered to have them on their turntables and tape decks. Though heavy metal was rapidly evolving through the 1980s, in lockstep with them was a growing hardcore punk rock movement. Black Flag, Bad Religion, and probably most notably for this story, the Dead Kennedys, would connect with the youth in a very similar way, as well as influencing bands like Exodus and Slayer, so it's impossible to see heavy metal evolve the way it did without legendary bands like them. Dead Kennedys vocalist and prolific eccentric Jello Biafra would have his own battle thanks to the PMRC and the overreaching arm of government forces. A few months after the conclusion of the PMRC hearing, the Dead Kennedys would release their third studio record, Frankenchrist. The album would spark a massive controversy, not for the music or lyrical content, but for the H.R. Geiger artwork that would be distributed with the record's packaging. It was a painting titled Landscape Number XX. I'm not going to show it, but it's fairly raunchy to put it mildly, and I'm sure you're already Googling it. The PMRC would launch a complaint, and after a concerned parent discovered the artwork, would be responded to by the Los Angeles police, seeing Biafra arrested and charged with distributing harmful material to minors. Some have speculated that he and his label were targeted because they were small and would be easy to squash. It required a grassroots defense fund to pay for legal proceedings, and facing a year in jail and a $2,000 fine, the trial would see the jury deadlock in favor of acquittal, prompting a mistrial. A judge would then order all charges be dropped, and it would be quite the mask-off moment for the PMRC and the forces that they were in legion with to stifle artistic expression. As the decades progressed, the PMRC would continue to raise their concerns to mostly deaf public ears. Ears likely suffering from tinnitus from the increased sales of raunchy albums. And while they never technically disbanded, they would stand as a bit of a flash in the pan of American history, thoroughly rinsed by Snyder and artists all over the world. And even as their effectiveness, or lack thereof, would become apparent, no federal legislation would follow, and a natural balance between artists, publishers, and storefronts would continue to evolve. The debate about censorship is still very much so alive and well today, though it's typically aimed at other facets of our lives like social media or political ideology. It's a fine line when defining censorship itself, and debates about things like social media arguably having more power than any one government does are likely to continue on until we're enslaved by our AI robot overlords, so enjoy it while you can. Although no legislation would come, that wouldn't keep heavy metal out of the courtroom entirely.
I first read about the court case of James Vance versus Judas Priest in a small item in Variety, and I thought it was one of the most ridiculous things I'd ever read. And I thought it was an example of what has turned out to be a widespread trend in America, which is that people have a hard time taking responsibility for their own actions and feeling that they have power over their own lives.
Boogeyman tales of satanic backmasking in heavy metal are as old as the genre itself. With myths surrounding acts as far back as the Beatles, it's no wonder these things would follow behind the heavier, more explicit rock genres. But where expressions would be challenged would be in notable civil cases, where bands and artists were formally reprimanded by a party claiming that they were responsible for some horrific real-life situation, and free speech again would be put to the test, but this time with lawyers and judges involved. Now, civil cases are notoriously much more lenient with what they will and will not hear in a court, but they exist within the same constitutional structure that criminal trials do, albeit with a wider scope of allowable evidence. And in plenty of tragic situations, families looking for a cause for otherwise unexplainable actions have turned their sights on some of heavy metal's biggest figures. And as the 1990s kicked off, the next threat to heavy metal's expression would begin to take shape. On December 23rd of 1985, two young men in Spark, Nevada reportedly spent a night drinking, smoking, and listening to Judas Priest's 1978 album Stained Class. For whatever reason, which would be later argued in court, Raymond Belknap and James Vance ended their evening in a dramatic action against themselves with the use of a shotgun. Belknap would perish instantly, but Vance, with life-threatening injuries, would survive and eventually partially recover from the attempt. The Vance and Belknap families would file a lawsuit in 1989, alleging that Judas Priest's Stained Class album contained powerful subliminal messaging, pointing the finger for the men's actions at the band. The lawsuit would focus on the track Better by You, Better Than Me, which was a cover song originally performed by Spooky Tooth, an English rock band from the late 60s. The plaintiffs claimed that the subliminal messaging in question was embedded into this track particularly. They would demonstrate in court by altering the speed of playback to reveal what they were interpreting as the words "do it," alleging that this is why Vance and Belknap would take such extreme action. The defense would point out purely coincidental phonetic sounds, with members of the band testifying in court that no such messaging existed and that the grieving families were simply reaching for an explanation for the actions. In the end, in August of 1990, the judge ruled in favor of Judas Priest and CBS Records, concluding that there was no scientific evidence proving that subliminal messages could compel individuals to commit such acts. It seems silly now to think about, but it was a victory for the freedom of expression afforded to heavy metal artists. Similarly, in an incident taking place in October of 1984, 19-year-old John McCullum would commit to a similar action while listening to Ozzy Osbourne. The song in question appeared on Ozzy's solo debut Blizzard of Oz, and I'm not going to say which song it is because I want people to see this video, but browsing the list, you can probably guess which one it was. McCullum's family filed the lawsuit against Osbourne and CBS Records in 1986, alleging that Osbourne's track written about the passing of AC/DC's Bon Scott had driven their young son to action. They would highlight misheard lyrics, intentionally or otherwise misinterpreting them to attempt to bolster their claims, but like the Judas Priest lawsuit that would happen a couple years later, proving that lyrics can lead to actions is an impossible task. In 1988, the case was dismissed by a California court, with a judge ruling that the song was protected under the First Amendment, which guarantees freedom of speech, and that there was insufficient evidence to link the song directly to McCullum's actions. And to cap off this section with a story that I've told in full detail here on the channel before, thrash metal Big Four pioneer Slayer faced a set of lawsuits throughout the 1990s, stemming from the brutal actions taken by 3 California teenagers against 15-year-old Elise Poller. The first lawsuit would see the Poller family pointing to Rain in Blood's Postmortem and Seasons in the Abyss's Dead Skin Mask. Both tracks are certainly shocking, which is precisely the point, but could not be proven to have instructed the boys who thought sacrificing a virgin to the devil would grant their metal band hatred, fame, and glory to take the actions that they took. The second lawsuit filed would take aim at both the band and distributors, alleging that they were intentionally and knowingly distributing material that was harmful to children, but again, their freedom of expression was protected under the First Amendment, and that case would also be thrown out as the new millennium began. All of these instances would see heartbroken families looking for answers and explanations. So while I don't believe their aim was simply to stifle the freedom of expression, those were precisely the stakes at hand. And in the end, they would all serve to strengthen the First Amendment, establishing important precedents in the civil courts.
First of all, I think it is the parents' concern, it is not the government's concern.
Yeah, they agree with you on that.
Well, that doesn't come across in the way they have been speaking. The whole drift that I've gotten, based on the media blitz that has attended the PMRC and its rise to infamy, is that they have a special plan, and it has smelled like legislation up until now. There are too many things that look like hidden agendas involved with this, and I'm a parent. I've got 4 children. 2 of them are here. I want them to grow up in a country where they can think what they want to think, be what they want to be, and not what somebody's wife or somebody in government makes them be. I don't want to have that, and I don't think you do either.
While it wasn't the only art to be targeted, heavy metal has been in the crosshairs of censorship in major ways throughout its formative decades. And I'm pretty sure there's plenty I didn't cover, but I do feel that the stories we heard today paint a pretty good picture of the importance of freedom of expression. The source of these adversaries would appear to be ones of genuine concern or even heartache, as opposed to just stifling creativity for the sake of power or nefarious motives. But as each one stepped up to challenge the music, they would be one by one set down as the arguments were presented. And even in cases where it would appear that they won at first, the growing popularity and rebellious teenage demographic would only ensure that the art form thrived in the wake of any actions taken. As youth drive popular culture, it is often true that they will do what they can to rebel against the previous generation's standards, either in the name of progress or even just to piss off their parents as some sort of retaliation. We all did it in some way, and I still do it, because clearly I stopped maturing at the age of 16. I mean, look at the way I'm dressed. Come on. However you feel about the First Amendment or whatever political flag you plant on the hills around you doesn't really matter. Even in a world where we were less politically divided, there were forces at play that crossed those two-party boundaries. In the modern age, we've managed to otherize each other in a way that I feel is super harmful to our ability to coexist with each other. And I can only hope that we continue to gather under the Headbanger banner and show our appreciation and reverence for this art that has been a conduit for our pain, raised us up when we're down, or inspired us to be something more than what society expects us to be. The ability to express ourselves in whichever way we see fit is important, not only for the person expressing, but for the society that they are casting those expressions into. Even if the content is offensive or shocking, the information is critical to challenging ideas and furthering public discourse. I accept the irony of saying this in a video where I almost had to say unaliving solution, but the message is an important one. And if you disagree with me, I'm sure you'll let me know about it. If you've gotten this far, thank you once again for letting me tell you another story. I have a lot of fun putting these together, and the payoff is certainly the conversations that stem from them. If you liked it, don't forget to like the video. If you hated it, hit the dislike and tell me why. And subscribe for more if you're not already. If you don't want to wait for the next big video, I do shorts almost every day. And if you would like to support further, especially with how heavy some of these topics can get, you can become a member or join the Patreon for early access to videos, podcast episodes, special Discord access, and future exclusive content. And if you're feeling super generous, tell your friends about it. Make sure to check out the Talk and Roll podcast, where I talk with up-and-coming artists, and follow me at Hawk and Load on whichever platform is your favorite. These videos are a one-man operation. I handle everything from the thumbnails to the writing to the editing and everything else that goes into it. So I'm working on getting to some anticipated projects like the follow-up to the West Memphis 3, or even some more basic case files true crime stuff. If there is anything that you would like to see, please let me know in the comments. Thank you guys so much for 20,000 subscribers, which is wild to me, and for all the feedback that you've given me on the previous videos. If you liked this video, you might dig the video on Satanic Panic I just put out. Remember to love your pets, and I'll catch you in the next video. Big Patreon and member shout out to Daniel, Gage, Jeremy, Leslie, Lisa, McLean, Richard, Ryan, Weapon Son Gaming, Craig, Dr. Spiderface, Christian, big shout out for Melissa, who is both a member and a patron, Ghost Dragon, who did all the music for this video, and of course my mommy.